That to me is looking at the problem for some reason not to do it, when in fact the reason to do it is for the competency of the inherent unit of people, whether it's a platoon, a company, or a battalion. I believe that battalions ought to be maneuverable elements from one division to another. They can be moved overseas, do a job, be attached around. Matter of fact, that's why we designed them that way. And then to get some notion that, no, I can't accept a new battalion because then they don't know what to do, and geez, it'll be a while before they learn the GDP positions they got to go on. And I just say, doesn't wash with my view. I mean, even in combat, when we reconstitute a battalion, the battalion may be given training in new reserves and all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't know the new terrain it may go in day after tomorrow. So that whole thing is just fraught with leftovers, which I think don't serve us very well. I think maybe Vietnam got a lot of people into the wrong idea. I remember as a Corps Artillery Group executive officer disassembling a battalion that had been sent to Vietnam under the, quote, infusion program, unquote. I think one of the things you ought to research is who gave those orders. Was that done by the Department of the Army? Was that done by Westmoreland? Who gave that kind of order out? Here's a battalion that had trained together, soldiered together in California, said goodbye to its families together, came to Vietnam, and we had the audacity, the unmitigated audacity, to take the unit and disassemble it, so it wouldn't all rotate out at one time. Now that to me is just terrible personnel policy.
So they sort of cross-moved people back?
Well, what they said was, we want you to take out half the chief of sections, half the chief of smokes, half the gunners, half the officers, and move them to some other unit so the unit won't all destruct a year from now when its tour is over. So we actually disassembled a unit that had been trained to operate together, and on orders from higher authority, we were told to wreck the unit from all of its interpersonal relationships.
Is this one of the battalions sent to your group?
Yeah. I mean, think about that, man. Who invented that? Was that the chief of staff of the Army that said, did Lyndon Johnson say do that? I mean, who in the hell invented that?
It could very well have happened at a local level.
Well, I mean, it wasn't inside our group.
No, it might have been field force.
No, I wouldn't have been in 2 field force because all MACV controlled all the personnel assignments about that. So I just can't imagine how they get at it.
The thinking is, everybody over there who was in command was screaming about the turnover and upset about what happens when we lose a certain June, or there was always some sort of month when the unit lost a very high proportion of its people.
Well, I think that may have been outgrowth of some decision that said, because the unit is only going to have, because the people in the unit only have a life of 12 or 13 months, that you'd have to constitute a new unit in the United States, and then they'd have to go over and fly over and take it over, as opposed to, and then let the other unit dissolve. And you say, well, I got a lot of people left in that unit who have more service, but then, but the whole notion is to destroy the inherent goodness of the unit that had been built by officers in charge of the human element of a unit. That's just crazy stuff.
It was crazy. How did the unit Did you see it through for a few
Well,
months?
I can't recall. I know that it had a terrible time in gunnery. In fact, they dropped a battalion load of artillery on the USRV helicopter pad in the vicinity of Long Bend. They managed to knock out 12 helicopters that belonged to us. So from one thing, their accuracy was very good. I mean, it hit the airfield. But Bruce Palmer wasn't very happy with that. So that tells you that. I tell you what I think. I really believe this. Now, I believe this intuitively, and I have no evidence to back it up. I believe that, and this may sound like a little bit of a slam, I believe that the David Marlows of the Army of the end of World War II are responsible for all that going on, and are responsible for
The whole notion of short tours.
the notion of not seeing an action through to completion, and for the short tour policy both in Korea and Vietnam.
I think you're right.
Now let me tell you why I believe that. I believe that they were asked, how do we stop the riots after World War II, VJ Day, VE Day, and they invented a point program that permitted the people who'd been in the Army the longest and seen the most combat to get out the soonest. And so that stopped the riots at the time. And personnelists thereafter thought it would be a good idea to have a rotation program in Korea and a rotation program in Vietnam, so that we lost the notion that you went to serve until it was over.
For the duration.
And how that got started, I don't know, but my intuition tells me that it flows from the tail end of World War II, when we were looking for a demobilization policy. And then we went to the notion that we will have an individual replacement system game. Now, how far back the individual replacements, I guess they worked in
Back in 1918.
in the famous war, but in World War II, but I think that did us in.
Yeah, the whole idea of human beings as interchangeable spare parts comes out of the industrial Taylor's idea that people is...
I think that's quite different in the military. I think it's a team effort. And oh, by the way, isn't it interesting that industry is trying to look how to build teams in their workplace?
They are starting to do that now.
And yet we think we're the best at building teams. And then we have policies that tear teams up. Now, can you explain that? In a theoretical stance, how do you explain that? I mean, what's your degree in, your PhD?
History.
Can you explain to me from a sociological standpoint how you organize, train, deploy, and fight as a team, and then you have a calculated policy to destroy the team in the progress of continued fighting?
It's an expediency thing. It doesn't have theory.
It's crazy.
Yeah, there's people groping for ways of solving problems and coming up with solutions that solve components of the problem, but exacerbate the major part of the problem.
I think Bono took a major step forward in the Persian Gulf when he levied units to build 100 tank crews, 100 artillery crews, and 100 Bradley crews, and had them on standby, ready to go in as replacements, as crews. So 11-man squad, 4-man tank crew, 7-man artillery crew, or whatever it turned out to be.
Right. That was a step forward. There, you have to watch out for the first sergeant, though.
Sure, but I'm saying the notion was right.
Yeah.
Now, how they formulated the crews, I don't know, because I wasn't there, but I mean, that's an interesting thing to pursue.
It is, and we saw some teams, clusters of people go into the 7th Division, because of course it had continual attrition and needed to be.
Well, what I guess what I'm saying to you about that is, one of the things you ought to look at is Bono thought what he was doing, which is get the cruise rate. Was he suborned by subordinate leaders?
I'm not sure whether he was or
But
not.
we ought to find that out. In other words, I think one of the tricks that you got to do in this volume, if this is what your intent is that you also want to show that guys like Bono made a move to get at small unit replacement, in this case the squad level. Did his agents below him faithfully carry out the intent, the commander's intent, or did they fuck up and send out the get the hoods together and send them over there, or were they responsible actions by the various subordinates that said, no, I'm going to give them the very best crews I got because they'll have to go shoot and there'll be human life at stake. If they did the latter, then we're beginning to make progress. If they did the former, it says that the AGs got into it again.
Yeah. One of the problems we ran into in the 7th Division was as the companies got smaller and smaller from guys getting hurt or making asses of themselves one way or another. First sergeants would cross level and try to keep each squad, so there's supposed to be 9, but there weren't enough to go around, and try and make each one have 7 instead of some have 5 and some have 9 and some have 8. There's just a whole array of pressures out there, expediency-related pressures, to suborn the idea of unit integrity. And so it's a very tough fight, and I think Bono did a right thing. I don't know what's going to happen, but there's so many elements of your story which are parables of parallels to support the integrity of teams, the usefulness of the integrity of teams. That I think it's an important theme. I think the fact that it's told through your eyes and ears and experience and struggles, and arguments, will give it a lot more vitality and vividness than it's just sort of told in an abstract sort of way. I was wondering, in the 11th Division, what kind of relationships there were between officers and NCOs. You mentioned how close the officers got with each other. Was there also a closeness between officers and NCOs?
Yeah, very much so. By the time that the division got rid of its riffraff under General Hugh Harris, and then the stabilization of the cadre having been stabilized coming to Europe and getting rid of the sluggoids, the NCOs and the officers became very tightly interwoven because, in the main, battery commanders might come and go a little bit on the grounds of professional development to get a guy a battery for 18 months or whatever. But in the main, the NCOs were stable in the unit. And so there's very little shifting around to the NCOs. The first sergeant was the first sergeant for the whole tour over there, 3 years. And the sergeants major were, you may say, well, that's stultifying and all that. And I'm saying, no, it said they stayed with the division, and there was still enough upward mobility, although I grant that that was a period of downsizing of the Army at that particular time in the late 60s. But the officers knew the NCOs very well. I mean, the group of officers we had in my rocket battery had been together as a group in a 155 battery for 2 years before they ever became rocket merchants, and then became rocket merchants for 2 years. But they all knew one another, and you knew who you could count on and depend upon. I remember, just happened to remember the name of one of the guys was a mechanic, chief mechanic, guy named Fosno, and Fosno could make anything run in the field. And so everybody counted on Fosno, and Fosno was that way when he was in the howitzer battery, and in our battery, happened to be working for me in my platoon. He was a gem at making things run, and so our maintenance was always terrific. It was easy. I mean, it really was easy. Had a first sergeant named Harrington, and Harrington was easy, and Sabatier was my platoon leader, and Raphael Sabatier was a guy. He said, Raphael Sabatier, we're going to depart tomorrow morning, 6:30 in the morning, and there wasn't any slack about that. I mean, everybody knew exactly what we were going to do, and go to the field and go do it. And so a tremendous up and down vertical bonding went on there. The fact that it was a new weapon system creates a little halo effect, because you're trying to learn something new, but you're learning it together. And so his knowledge didn't transcend mine, and mine didn't transcend his. We were all learning together about that, and so it was quite a healthy relationship. And we knew when somebody was allowed to get tanked up and where to go to get him, but we knew the wives and all that kind of stuff. So very open relationship centered on combat readiness. And we had a technical proficiency inspection readiness problem as well. We had to pass for outside entities, which gave you a focal point for doing something not only with your division and its hierarchy, but the nuclear weapons people as well. Tremendous dependency on NCOs for both technical competence and tactical skills, because we operated at night. All of our operations were done at night. So it just went well. It was easy.
Was it quiet?
Easy. What do you mean quiet?
I mean, was it a lot of yelling around the battery, or?
Nah, pretty quiet.
Yeah.
A street formation in the morning at reveille or at the morning work call was never noisy. I don't recall ever. And it's very interesting you raise that, because I recall going down, standing behind a formation one morning when a first sergeant in the 82nd Airborne Division, when I'm a division artillery commander, and he's cursing the troops. And after it was all over done with and troops left, I went over to him and I said, report to your battery commander. I want to see you in my office this afternoon about 5:30. I never saw good people except during the duty day, and the bad people after 5 o'clock. So I called him in and I said, you know, I've heard some very foul language around, but I said, you're a first sergeant, and you were standing in front of a troop formation. And that was over and beyond the pale. you calling people by foul names and all that kind of stuff. And I said, so you're relieved. You need a break. You're going to move to my headquarters here. I mean, out of the battalion up to my headquarters. You're going to be my G2 sergeant. And when you get yourself squared away, come in and talk to me about going down to being a first sergeant. But you don't deserve to be a first sergeant anymore. I mean, that is really, really gross behavior. And he just absolutely, unmercifully foul-mouthed, eating people up and all that kind of stuff in front of their peer group and all that. I didn't hear any of that in lecture. I mean, after we got it settled down. Very professional gathering people.
That's what's happening in the 7th Division, too. Like you said about...
Oh, you know people. Look, when you know people,
Yeah, it just makes all the difference.
one is you know what their individual qualities are. You know who you can count on. You know, you make allowances for who you can count on, who you may have to shift responsibilities about. But there's camaraderie about it. There's also camaraderie between the NCOs because no one knows very well, know what they're able to do, what they don't. And then the troops have been there for a great period of time. They're very confident. I mean, a driver knows how to drive and he's got his license up to date, and so you don't have to screw around with that. And with the turmoil of people coming in, half the people don't have licenses when you. So this way, everybody's got a driver's license, and you never run the risk of putting a guy in driving a vehicle that hasn't got a license to drive the vehicle. And this happens all the time in the units turning over. You get guys driving vehicles, killing people,
Yeah.
running over people, you know, having accidents with people because you haven't got the unit settled down.
Right. Always boiling.
So the 11th became a unique organization. It had a period of crap and corruption in there that had to get weeded out. But once that got done, it became a unique organization. It's been together 5 years.
Yeah.
I mean, you really knew who the people were in an organization been there 5 years. Now, happily, that was 2 years in the States and 3 overseas. But I would say that, and a lot of people will claim, well, you get stale doing that. My view is you get efficient.
That's what happened to the 7th. When you started your operation in Panama, it was around Christmas time. A lot of the 7th Division units had people who stood down and on block leave. But there were a few people left, and the privates got those units ready to load out, put stuff on the pallets and strapped it down. I mean, they'd done it before, they knew how to do it, and they had a sense that this is my mission. And the sergeants and the lieutenants and the captains came rushing back and found everything ready. Just all they had to do was pick up their gear and go.
Put their camouflage on.
So the experience that you had with the 11th and that you tried to institutionalize, it works.
See, well, it would have worked if Scheidmeyer had stayed as chief of staff for another 2 years. But in the main, what happened is the trial period ran over Schei's departure. And it was not in General Wickham's viewfinder when he was chief. So I mean, he wasn't as hot on it as Meyer would have been. If Meyer had been there, we would have gotten it fully institutionalized. But it takes, ultimately, it has to be the chief of staff of the Army that institutionalizes. No other subordinate can do that. Because he has to tell his subordinate 4-star commanders, this is the way it is. We've tried it out in there 15 different ways, and now the decision time is it, and this is what we're going to do it. And that becomes, see, in a bureaucracy the size of the U.S. military, institutionalization becomes a crucial factor, and that institutionalization can come from only one of us, chief of staff. Of that magnitude, where you're wrenching, this is a major wrench. Supply policy, and you know how many people you promote to the grade of corporal, and sergeant, it's down the line, but when you make a major institutional wrench like cohort, well, there's only one officer in the Army can make it happen, that's chief of staff.
Yeah, they're at, like, well, it took, how long was it that you were supervising for recruiting? 8 years, I guess, altogether.
Yeah.
You really sort of get,
Well, direct operation 2 years, direct supervision 2 years, and 4 years of attentive supervision. Yeah, makes it happen.
yeah, that sort of gets the
You bet.
thing set. That's important. That was really important, I think. And
Well, for me to tell the PA&E of the Army for 4 straight years, don't ever bring me a shortage of money in the personnel account for quality people. And as principal resource allocator, which I was as the vice chief of staff of the Army, once you tell a guy there, he goes and does it. So, I mean, pretty soon it's cooking.
it's worked, too. It has really changed the nature of the Army.
You bet it has.
And I think that's the most important thing that will keep us from going back to where we were in 1949.
I think people understand that, but still, you have to have a cognizant authority pay attention to it. It cannot be left to, the quality of people in the Army cannot be left to a major general. It is so crucial that it is a 4-star general's business to assure the quality of the Army is right. And therefore, he has to spend time, maybe not a lot, but enough, to assure himself that it is high quality.
So many things can kind of slip through the cracks.
Well, it has to do with some people are interested in it, some people aren't. I mean, some people are historians and other people are personnel people. The fact that a historian gets interested in personnel, it's unusual. But the point I'm making is that, I'm talking about the details of personnel policy like that, but the point I'm making is that people have different bags
They do.
and their interests are different. John Wickham had a very interesting bag. His bag was joint operations. He had been a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as the director of the Joint Staff. Then he had been the Sync-Unc, and then he became the Chief of Staff. One of his primary interests was in the advancement of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He took it as a given that the personnel was taking care of itself. I'm talking about the accession game and all that.
Right.
Not that he didn't have interest in people, get interested in people, but whether or not it was 95% high school diploma grad or 55% high school diploma grad wasn't on his screen. Now, joint interoperations between the Air Force and the Army was. So he and Wickham, or he and his colleague, the then Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Charlie Gabriel, spent a considerable amount of time sorting out Army Air Force issues. So a lot has to do with the interest of the leader as to what gets pushed on his watch. There's no doubt, if you look at Carl Bono's dictum, if he got up to speak once or 1,000 times, he had a stock phrase that he pushed, which is he wants a trained and ready Army. He didn't say that once, he said that 10,000 times. Now, what a lot of people didn't know, though, is he met every month with the recruiting chief. Because he wanted to make sure that the people side was straight, because he had an abiding interest in making that happen. When he left as the Chief of Staff, the next Chief of Staff didn't pay any attention to it.
He's starting to slide.
It wasn't interesting to him.
Yeah, but I mean, what's going on
Well,
back at the ranch?
Well, it
Is the
went
vice
along
looking-
fine because we were downsizing. It went along fine the first year. The second year, '93, it was slipped a little bit, so he got more interested in it. But meanwhile, General P, now the vice chief, has picked it up as a monthly briefing. It's not on the horizon of the other guy. He makes assumptions going with it.
Right. Yeah, you can only have so many things on your horizon,
Yeah.
that's for sure.
So something like the quality of people or the cohort system or individual versus unit replacement, small unit or whatever kind of unit replacement you like, is I would say there are only 2 4-star generals. Well, I'd say there are 3 4-star generals besides me who were interested in that. One was Don Starry.
Oh, see, I didn't know he was interested in it.
Shy Meyer. And I think if you will read, there is a book produced by the Potomac Foundation, which is run by Dr. Joe Braddock of BDM fame. They just produced a book, and the lead article is in there by Starry, and I just glanced at it, but I think the article talks about small unit rotation. I mean, that's essentially what it's about. I didn't read it in detail. But Starry was interested in it, Shy was interested in it, and Bono was interested in it. And on the fringe, Cavazos. Now, 2 of those guys were chiefs, and the other chiefs weren't in those periods of time. And Shy tried to get it going, and Carl didn't try to get it going, but he was faced with fighting a war right in the middle of his tour, so, and he did it very well, but he did use one of the principles there, which was put the small unit replacement squads together in case he had large casualties out of that.
Well, should we get together again?
Sure. That's your schedule?
Got a whole bunch of questions about things we talked about last
Okay.
time.
Yeah.
It's not in his here.
Not in there? Okay. Fine.
Anyway, I hope that'll work.
Thank you very much.
When you were talking about your qualifications to be the subject of a biography and your credibility with other people and your knowledge of what went on in the force and so on, you mentioned you've never been a battalion staff officer, but then at other times you said you were battalion survey officer and battalion liaison officer to a battalion.
Yeah.
Were they sort of
The point about that is that in today's Army, the pattern of advancement for selection to be a battalion commander generally includes service at the grade of major
Okay, as an S3
or senior captain on a battalion staff, either in the S3 position or at the executive officer position. In my case, my battalion staff duty took place as a lieutenant, and being the, let's say, battalion survey, reconnaissance and survey officer certainly doesn't measure up in the eyes of board members, let's say today, that the XO's job would be, or a battalion S3's job. So that's to clarify what I intended there.
Right. Yeah, of course, you had to take vigorous action in order to get a command without having had that background.
Yeah, my assignment officer told me when I got ready to leave Leavenworth, I was a lieutenant colonel who left Leavenworth. I'd served my entire majority at West Point and Leavenworth, 3 years at West Point and about 6 months at Leavenworth before I got promoted. So when my assignment officer came out to assign me to Vietnam, his disclaimer was, you haven't, so while your record is a good record, you haven't met the gates to have a command in Vietnam, which I had asked to be posted to Vietnam. And I said, well, what are those gates? And he said, well, you haven't been a battery commander in your branch, like field artillery in a cannon artillery unit. And I said, yeah, that's right, I haven't done that. He said, you haven't been a battalion XO or S3, and I said, that's right, I haven't done that. And he said, you haven't been a fire support officer at the division level. And I said, yeah, you're right, I haven't done that. And he said, you haven't commanded a battalion. And he said, those are the 4 criteria that General Westmoreland, or the MACV commander, has laid down as a requirement.
All 4 of them or some of them?
One of the 4. You had to be one of the 4. And he said, you don't measure up. And I said, fine and dandy. Just order me to Vietnam, and we'll see what happens. I'll take care of it myself. I guess my view is that having been in the 11th Airborne Division for a period of almost 5 years, and knowing the division as I knew it, and understanding the role of field artillery in support of the ground gaining arms, it wasn't a problem, in my view, about understanding what my mission was to support the infantry. Of course, that's what would have been the primary tanks weren't in the game there. So I was essentially a light artilleryman, and I understood the nature of supporting the infantry. I'd been a battalion liaison officer with the infantry, and I'd been in a division artillery battalion for quite a bit of time, and I had been in the division artillery staff for several years, and I'd been a honest John guy, which would be equated to being a GS artilleryman. So I knew all the rigmarole about supporting infantry, so that didn't bother me, but apparently General Westmoreland had good and valid reason for whatever he did, and so I had to go and fight for it on my own.
Well, yeah, it seems to me that his reasons...
It's interesting that the whole business is that it's interesting a guy would end up running the personnel business for the Army, who essentially never measured up to what the desk officers in Milperson would like you to believe.
Yeah, and that is interesting, and I was wondering how and when your reputation started to emerge. Apparently it was pretty early, because it seems to me that in those days the job of general's aide was competitive, and each battalion would send up a good guy for it.
Being the general's aide in the 11th Airborne Division, I think is 11th Airborne Division Artillery, Brigadier General's aide, is relatively inconsequential. I mean, they're looking around for a, quote, spiffy-looking lieutenant, and I guess I was a spiffy-looking lieutenant, and I knew what my business was as a lieutenant. But I wouldn't hold that up as any big candle. I think a major break, you look back on your life and you look at major breaks, and a major break in my life occurred at West Point by being assigned there as a faculty member. Now, I really had trouble. The first 6 months of that time was a learning period.
Yeah, you hadn't been through it. You were being
Well, I hadn't,
assigned as
that's right.
staff
And
officer.
I was not a graduate, and I hadn't been through it, and so I had to learn the distinctive difference between unshined shoes and improperly shined shoes, which I thought to be sort of a bullshit operation. But I played the game, and then I fell under the supervision of the then Commandant of Cadets, who was Michael Davison. And Davison, I believe, looking back on it, although I didn't think so much at the time, he gave me a job that I didn't want. And that job was to be the Cadet Activities Officer. And he did me a favor by giving me that job, but I didn't realize it, which was, it was a job that had the opportunity to be all you can be with very little supervision, where you could, in fact, exert your initiative.
Was it a job nobody much wanted as well as
Nobody
you?
wanted a job, and it's a dog job, and as a matter of fact, it robbed you of your weekends. I mean, your work really started at 3:30 every afternoon when the cadets got out of class. You had to do work like every other staff officer would. And I would look at that as being divisional staff work, if you look back on it. Because I was operating at a place where there were brigadier generals and three-star generals, the superintendent and the brigadier general who's a commandant of cadets. And I was a major, so I was a principal staff officer.
Do you also have a company that you were?
I had the company for 1 year.
I see.
And then he put me in that particular job, and he called me up one day and said, "You're going to be the cadet activities officer." And I moaned and groaned and all that kind of stuff. And it turned out that I learned a lot. I learned how to operate independently, inside of a structure, obviously, but independently, in a job which benefited cadets. So if you look at it in a different role, you could say you pulled your staff officer tour at a division level. Well, what you didn't do is you weren't with troops in the way in which you were with troops in a division. In other words, you had cadets, and of course cadets are quite different from that, and highly structured environment. But mine was highly structured, but gave an enormous opportunity for initiative.
Nobody wanted to do what you were doing.
And nobody particularly wanted to do what I was doing, so it was, on the one hand, a tremendous learning curve. I mean, I got to know how to do things in a civilian environment that later would pay out dividends, for example, in recruiting business. And also had to learn, I had to obviously live within the regulations and the rules of the United States Military Academy, and doing that to make sure that I didn't besmirch the reputation of the U.S. Military Academy, of the value system that went along with the Military Academy. But I fretted about that a lot, because now it's 1965, 64, and 65, and 66, and my colleagues are back overseas. It was at that time that Schwarzkopf and I were up at West Point together.
Yes.
And we're both the same grade, and he went to the, sort of an interesting vignette, he went to his boss and said,